Welcome to another edition of Life, Love, and Philosophy. My special guest today has become a regular on this program. He's my friend, Dan Mahala. And for those of you who have seen some of our conversations in previous programs, you know that Dan is an inveterate traveler. He and his wife have been spending 3 or 4 months each year in France for many years, as well as visiting other countries. Dan is also a passionate reader and has taught history at the college level here on Staten Island and in fact in some other boroughs as well. And also, interestingly enough, has taught at the prison on Staten Island. And today one of the things I want to do is to try to pursue several of Dan's interests. Dan, welcome to the program. I think the first thing I'd like to do is to start with recent developments in France. Yeah. Since you have a great interest in that country. And we know that several months ago, the French elected a new president. Yeah. They elected Nicolas Sarkozy. Yeah. Sarkozy.
Yeah, Sarkozy.
Sarkozy, who is right of center politically.
Yeah.
And some would say that represents a kind of change in France, in that France is regarded, generally speaking, as a very liberal-minded country. Before we talk specifically about what the new government proposes to do, let me point out that the finance minister of France, I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly, Christine Lagarde, oui. Has said this, that, and I'm quoting her now, "We are trying to change the psyche of the French people in relation to work." And she then went on to say that she's urging her compatriots to work harder, earn more, and get rich.
Yeah.
Now tell us, what does this new government, this center-right government, propose in terms of changing France?
It's kind of a typical center-right government, which is more inclined to help industry, to help production, and less inclined for social programs and enhancement of poor and eliminating conditions that breed poverty and things like that. So the first thing they do is, as she is proposing, is to make things better for big industry. And the first thing that she attacked, and Sarkozy also, was a 35-hour week. This became law a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I didn't realize that.
Oh, yeah.
Just interrupt for a moment and emphasize this to the viewers. France has a law mandating the 35-hour week.
Yeah, 35 hours is the full work week. And they know they're not going to be able to change that. I mean, reduce that or increase it or anything else. But what they're attempting to do at this time is make it easier for industry to work within that 35 hours. So industry can now demand that a worker work maybe 10 hours a day without getting any overtime. You know, instead of anything over 7 hours being overtime, you work 10 hours here and 10 hours there. You work your 35 hours, but at industry's request. So this makes it a little better for scheduling people and things like that. And that's one of the big things they want to start. Another thing she mentions, I read the same article, that we're going to try to increase our workforce from 63% of the population to 70% of the population. Now that, to me, you got to scratch your head and say, why would you want to do that? Isn't it ideal for a country building its wealth to have fewer people working? In other words, more single workers in the family, more people home to take care of the children, more time for leisure, more time for study and other things. But no, they want to go in the opposite direction. I would think if 63% of your adult population is working, let's try to reduce that to 60%, not to 70% like they're trying.
It is interesting what you're saying, because if I understand you correctly, you're suggesting that the French temperament is such that, generally speaking, French people prefer more leisure than working harder, even if it means more money. And apropos of that, I just want want to quote Roger Cohen, who writes for the New
Yeah.
York Times and used to write for the International Herald Tribune. In fact, I first began reading him in Europe. And here's what he has to say about the French attitude towards work. Deep in the French soul resides the notion that work is exploitation, a ruse concocted by American robber barons, best regulated and minimized and offset by hours of idleness.
Yeah, well, this is very obvious if you spent any time throughout Europe, and I won't limit this to France alone, is that people prize their time, that they're able to do what they want to do. I mean, the French have a law also where they get 6 weeks vacation. Well, that's a big thing with all of them. And they spend their year around planning that and so forth. Whereas here we think that's unusual, and maybe it's a Puritan work ethic, whatever it is, but that's defying the country, that's defying nature. Whereas the French say the more vacation, the more free time we have, the better our lives are going to be.
If I can play the devil's advocate for a moment, some people, and I think Sarkozy would be in this group, would claim that France is not going to be able to compete with India, with China, with the United States, if people in France don't work harder. Any comment on that?
Yeah, there's no question about it. It's the right view. I mean, the political, those to the right, view this as the top-down strategy, as we've had in this country for years. You've got to help industry. Industry will invest, industry will produce, become more competitive, and put more people to work, and we'll be a richer nation. That's what they're trying to achieve. Sarkozy has already been accused during his campaign as being the American. You want us to live under what they call brutal capitalism, like the Americans experience.
Yeah.
And he's trying to move to the right, and there's good reason too, to make French corporations more competitive. I mean, it's a global economy. Everybody's competing with everybody else around the world. So you have to make your firms, your enterprises more competitive with the world as we know it. But at the same time, what are you going to take from? Who are you going to hurt in the process of making them more competitive? Are you going to hurt the workers? Are you going to reduce their salaries, free time, or whatever else? Or are you going to raise taxes on the rich and do it otherwise?
It does seem, though, from what I read, that the French people, in terms of their attitudes, political attitudes, are moving a little bit more to the right.
Yes.
Would you say that's true?
Yeah, there's no question.
The fact that he was
about it.
elected, the fact he's a center-right candidate was elected.
Yeah, there's no question. There's a economic switch, to say the least, throughout the world. I think China is going more to the right. China is, and Russia and every other country sees the competition involved, and how are we going to improve conditions for our corporations and workforce. And you have to do this by cutting some of your social programs, making things more competitive for your corporations, and that's the way they're doing it.
Sarkozy has said that besides urging his compatriots to work harder and produce more, he also believes that the taxation system in France needs revising, and he wants a cap of 50% on income tax. This is incredible that a conservative is willing to go with an income tax rate, the highest rate of 50%.
Try to pass that in this country.
Yeah, interesting. And I did a little research on this. In fact, we've read some similar articles, and I was astonished to find out that many wealthy French people over the years have paid much more than 50% of their income in taxes, because they have what's called the wealth tax.
Yeah.
And I think if you make a certain amount of money, I know this, if you make more than a certain amount of money, you pay, in addition to the highest tax bracket rate, you pay a special tax. And the poster boy for this is Johnny Hallyday, a famous French rock star, who was paying 72% of his income in taxes some years ago, and got so fed up with paying so much in taxes, he decided to leave France and move to Switzerland.
Yeah.
And I've read that approximately 500,000, this is according to the International Herald Tribune, by the way, approximately 500,000 wealthy French people have moved out of the country because they felt the taxes were just too high.
Yeah, I read that same article, and I did a little research on it. It's something in round figures, this wealth tax, which is above and beyond the top tax limit of 48%. This wealth tax, you pay like 0.5% of your wealth over $1 million, and it's a rate a rate that expands to 1.8% of your wealth over $20 million. That's putting it in dollars from the euro, but you know, it hits very few people. It hits there's not many people that have the kind of wealth that they're going to pay tax like that. Johnny Halliday is a big rock star for 30 years, and he's been in demand in concerts and everything else. He's one of the most popular entertainers in France. He pays up to 72% of his income. That's on his final income after he goes through the various brackets like we have here. He might pay 72%, anything over so many millions of dollars of income or wealth that he's maintained. And yeah, there are a lot of people leaving because they can go to Belgium, they can go to Switzerland and pay a lot lower rate. And you know, I'm not so sure that's a great loss to the country of those that don't want to contribute, that they live outside the country. And I would even think that you know, maybe there should be a special penalty for this, because it is in a way unpatriotic. I mean, to save money is one thing when you're making $50,000 a year or $80,000 a year, but when your income is up in the multi-million dollars, that's already, you know, I think going too far.
If I could play the devil's advocate here then, as I understand you, you don't think it's unfair to tax a very wealthy person 72% of his income?
Well, I think taxes should be installed that does the least damage to the people paying the taxes. I mean, if people making $50,000 are paying 10% of their income in taxes, that's hurting, because that's depriving them of something. A person, you know, I hate to look at Wall Street and some of their CEOs, but they do make 10, 20, $50 million a year. To put their upper income in a higher bracket doesn't hurt anybody. And that's what I consider a fair tax.
You know, what you're saying reminds me a little bit about a little bit of Franklin D. Roosevelt. Roosevelt, as you know, is a very wealthy man.
Yep.
And at one time he proposed, not in a serious way, but he considered the idea of a maximum income in America.
Yeah.
In fact, we know that many wealthy people at the time Roosevelt was president very much disliked him because his administration raised taxes on the rich so much, and they couldn't believe that one of their own, a fellow wealthy person, would do this. With regard to being wealthy in France, I think it's fair to say traditionally, perhaps since the French Revolution, the French have had a somewhat different attitude towards wealth and wealthy people than have Americans. I have two interesting quotes here from French people on this subject. Anne-Marie Mitterrand is a French writer, and she said this, and I'm quoting her. She's a contemporary French writer. In France, to earn a lot of money is seen to be a bit criminal. I'll say it again, I messed that up. In France, to earn a lot of money is seen to be a bit criminal. And Balzac, very famous French writer, man of letters, he said this, and again I'm quoting Balzac, "Behind every great fortune lies a crime." Do you think, you know, based on your years living in France, again I mentioned at the top of the program that you and Jill have spent 3 or 4 months in France almost every year for about 20 years. 1 year you spent living almost the entire year in France. Do you get that impression from the French people you talk to, that their attitude towards wealth is different from the attitude of the typical American towards wealth?
Yeah, very much. And I think our attitude has changed in the last 30 or 40 years. When before that time, you know, not many Americans would say greed is good and the kind of fortunes our chief CEO makes is fair and just and so forth. And France hasn't changed. You know, we were originally hardworking and a meritorious society, and have changed that quite a bit recently. France has maintained itself, as Balzac's quote clearly indicates. Behind every fortune, there's a criminal. There's a crime or a criminal. And you see this throughout. I mean, first thing is that when you sit down with several Frenchmen around a table having coffee or a glass of wine or something, you'll seldom talk about money, seldom. And I don't know why. It might be the fact that they don't want to use money as a judgment in one's character or one's interest or one's worth through society. But if you do get to talk about it, if wealth is brought up, it's usually brought up in condemning the super rich.
Yeah.
And because they fully believe that there's a lot more to life than wealth. And those that do become wealthy are distorted characters of some sort that, you know, have their priorities not set up properly. And I think that this is very typical of the European, particularly the French.
Someone like Donald Trump perhaps would not be celebrated in France the way he's celebrated in America.
That's right. Here we look at a George Steinbrenner or Donald Trump as being kind of heroic, and people look up to him and say, you know, how can you criticize them? You've never made the money they have. That is not a European attitude. That's not a French attitude.
One of the things I have found interesting in spending a whole lot of time in Europe, as you do, I spent a lot of time in Holland, as you know, and in Spain and in Germany, is to learn about the differences in which Europeans see the idea of government and also the good life.
Yeah.
And let's focus on France now in terms of these things. It seems to me that the French, generally speaking, have a greater trust in government than do Americans. They apparently like the idea of big government, the welfare state, and also that their idea of the good life, as you've indicated before, is somewhat different, that it appears the typical Frenchman would rather have more leisure time than earn more money. I mentioned at the top of the program, the finance minister of France saying we are trying to change the psyche of the French people in relation to work. You can't imagine any cabinet member of George Bush or even a Democrat saying that. You think it's a fair statement to make that the French see government and the idea of the good life differently from the way Americans do?
Yeah, I think about this as the same way about greed is good and so forth. If we go back in America to the Roosevelt ages, as you've mentioned, the New Deal and so forth, people had faith in our government. People thought government was our friend. When the government came out with programs, they came out with programs to help the people that needed most help. And you turned to government if you wanted a job, if you wanted help, and so forth, and so on. But we've changed from that. All of a sudden, in the last 30 years, government is the enemy, as Ronald Reagan made famous.
Sure, yeah.
You know, we want small government. The government is our enemy. They're taking away our money.
And Reagan was very popular.
Yeah,
Ronald Reagan said these things.
And on this. The Europeans have never accepted this.
So apparently Reagan touched a responsive chord in the American psyche.
Yeah, now they've tried the same thing in Europe. Shrink government, don't turn to government, government social services should be reduced. Hasn't worked. The people have fought it. They love the social services. They love the network of social whatever they receive in unemployment.
Universal health care, higher unemployment benefits,
and all of these things.
Free college tuition.
And they believe in them, and they believe that it's government's job to provide those for the people.
Yeah.
That people shouldn't be on their own
at the outset of the program, I emphasized that the present French president, Sarkozy, is to the right of center. He's considered to be a French conservative. And here's my question for you. How is a French political conservative politician different from an American political conservative politician? After all, we have a left politically in our country. The French have a left. We have a right. They have a right.
Well, if you put them on the same scale, you know, the George Bush administration is the far right, the neoconservatives that are in power now. They're extreme. The French have some little movements here and there. Le Pen was one. They got 10 or 15% of the population. That might fit that category. Sarkozy, the center right, is more like our moderate Democrats would be today. right pretty much down the middle. He recognizes that the social programs are necessary, the people want them, that his job is to help the people maintain these as best he can. Also recognizes that French corporations must be made more competitive and so forth. So, but he sides a little bit more with the corporations than the socialists would with the social services. But he's more down the center, much more down the center, and recognizes that, hey, there's a class system represented by the corporations, there's a class system represented by the working class. We don't like to call it class systems in this country. They don't call it the class systems either, but they have different interests. They have different demands.
So a French conservative is not going to attack the social network, the social, what's the word I'm looking for? We know that in France there's a social support.
Net.
Social net, thank you.
Yeah.
Social net. I mentioned before the universal health care, very high unemployment compensation if you find yourself out of work, free college tuition, free daycare, correct?
Yes.
Free daycare.
Oh, and good daycare.
And if your wife gets pregnant, she can stay out of work for a year or two and get quite a bit of money while she's out of work.
And when she delivers, the husband gets paternity leave now, which is mandatory, 2 weeks paid leave for the father of the child.
So one of the differences between a French conservative and an American conservative is that a French conservative would be rather hesitant to attack any of these social programs because it's likely that he or she probably could not get elected. Is that a fair statement?
Oh yeah, there's no question about it. And the social program is so well entrenched in countries like France and Norway, Sweden, Italy, Germany, etc., that every time you threaten that you're putting yourself on dangerous ground, because the people aren't going to stand for it. You know, here we say, well, we have a very passive working class. We have had very few strikes in the past 30 or 40 years, like not like they used to be in the 50s and 60s. You know, that's good. The French say, no, that's not good at all. If they want to take away some of our social services, they want to move out our pensions, like we're doing in this country now, automatically, and nobody's protesting, the French are going to protest. They're going to let them know.
Perhaps the outstanding illustration of how a French conservative politician differs from an American is this. You recall earlier in the program, I made the point that Sarkozy is hoping to reduce the highest tax bracket to 50%, reduce it to 50%.
Yeah.
Now, I can't imagine any American conservative politician being satisfied with a maximum tax rate of 50%. You know, my guess is, and I'm only guessing, the typical conservative politician in America would probably say, you know, if the rich are paying 20 to 25%, that's high enough, more than high enough.
Yeah, and they wouldn't even touch a wealth tax in this country.
Yes.
Some tax on, you know, if you have $1 billion in wealth, you're going to pay 0.5% on that because we need it as a country.
What fascinates me in my yearly trips, bi-yearly trips, actually 2 trips a year at least I make to Europe, what fascinates me is how different their attitudes are politically, that conservatism has been in the ascent in our country for some years now, since Ronald Reagan, maybe even a little before Ronald Reagan, and a lot of Americans, of course, are to the right of center. Whereas in Europe, I think it's fair to say, I know it's fair to say, the vast majority of people would be categorized as liberals. So it is interesting that America, arguably the richest, most powerful country in the world, in fact, it's not even arguable, it's the most powerful country in the world, is a rather conservative country, and Western Europe is quite liberal.
Well, the 2 big influences here in this country that make us conservatives are the church, which we're the most religious country in the world, in the industrial world outside of Israel, and corporations, the power of corporations in our government and placing politicians and so forth. This has to make America a lot more, because the Europeans, religion is kind of on the back burner. It's not a very influential factor in their political, social lives. In their personal lives, possibly, we don't know. It's hard to measure. But it's not a factor in politics. No one cares whether you're a Mormon or an atheist or anything else when you run for political office in any country in Europe that I know of.
Yeah.
But here, it's an important factor. So that has to move everybody to the right. Whereas the social programs is what the people, the working class, and all people in Europe pride themselves.
This is quite interesting that you're saying this, because it does seem in America that many politicians, especially on the right, and some on the left also, do want to be perceived as being religious because they feel that helps them to get elected. I'm not suggesting that in many cases it might not be sincere. I'm sure in some cases it is. But I think the fact of the matter is, in fact, I know the fact of the matter is that in Europe, religion, again, just isn't an issue. For better or worse, it's just not an issue. That a politician probably is not going to pick up any extra votes if he is perceived to be a very religious person. In fact, it is interesting that Sarkozy, I think, is in the midst of getting divorced now. It may have already gone through, I don't know. His wife announced shortly after he was elected, his wife informed the press and her husband that she wanted to split. And from what I have read, it has not hurt him at all in terms of public approval.
It's a non-issue. It's a non-issue in France. As former prime ministers and presidents have gone through mistresses and divorces and so forth, it's a non-issue. They judge them on their political skills and ability.
Yeah. You know, we're running short on time. Can you just tell us in approximately 30 seconds what the French government's attitude is towards the Iraq war? What specifically Sarkozy, this conservative's attitude is towards the Iraqi war?
There's no question about where Sarkozy stands, and he said this, he said it to George Bush. He condemned, or was part of a government that condemned us getting into Iraq and still does. And he says that his friend George Bush made a mistake. And they are pretty friendly, as he spent a lot of time here. And he said he made a mistake, and it's his problem to deal with. The French are willing to help them get out, but America's got to get themselves, pull themselves together and resolve this problem pretty much on their own. But it's a serious mistake that they made, and Sarkozy is not in favor of any type of unilateralism. He's in favor of world institutions and things like that, which Bush is opposed to.
Dan, I appreciate you coming here. As usual, this went very fast.
Yeah.
You're going to have to come back.
Absolutely.
Thanks again. As is my custom, I'd like to end with a quote from Henry David Thoreau. But before I do, just a quick reminder that we have a website, and if you want to see some of our past programs, we have at least 10 or 12 programs now posted on the website, programs on Plato, on Freud, on Confucius, etc. And the website designation is www.lifeloveandphilosophy.com. Thoreau reminds us that we are all artists. In Walden, his masterpiece, he penned the following words: "To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts."